Welcome to the Galileo Ventures podcast. We are live from San Francisco from the shiny new Galileo San Fran office. Isn't that exciting?
Very, very exciting.
I'm here with Jack, co-founder of Tempest AI. I'm super excited to have a conversation with Jack. We just invested at Galileo Ventures and we've just announced it, so I thought it'd be a good time to invite you onto the pod. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. So good to be here.
Awesome. Let's dive in. Tempest is building a new type of game engine, but rather than me talk about it, Jack, I'm going to throw it to you. Tell us, what is Tempest AI?
So Tempest AI is a no-code based game engine that aims to let anyone create, play, and share a game with no previous game development experience.
Gotcha. And so we've obviously seen a lot of game generator prompt engines, and we've seen a lot of demos on X and other social networks where people just write a prompt. Is it just that, or what is it? How is it different to, those cool demos we've seen?
Yeah, so our Tempest goes a little bit deeper. So we do have a focus on those narrative-based RPGs.
Mm-hmm. And what's an RPG for someone?
Role-playing games.
Yep.
So just think video games that have this really core storytelling aspect.
Yep.
So Tempest is specifically designed around creating these types of games, which historically, using these traditional game engines, have always been the toughest and the longest games to build.
Why is that?
Primarily due to just the breadth of the content and how complex some of these games code really can get.
Right. And what's an example of a complicated RPG that's sort of a traditional game today?
Yeah, I think a good example would be, say, any of the Bethesda games, like Fallout 4, Skyrim. So these games, mechanically, very, very heavy. Lots of different things going on. Obviously, you have combat systems, you have inventory, you've got the whole NPC system with those massive branching dialogue trees.
Yeah.
And those types of games, they generally require around 200 to 500 developers full-time.
Really? Wow.
To order actually build those games.
Yeah.
So for the average solo creator, there are essentially locked out this entire genre.
Gotcha. So they can consume, but they can't create.
Yeah.
And so then I've played Fallout. Fallout's a fantastic game, and famously has now been made into a really great series on, I think, Amazon. Tell us, how long did it take to make Fallout? Give us maybe just an approximation so some of the listeners can sort of get a sense of the scale.
Yeah. So a game like that, it took 5 years in order to actually build it, which is just insane.
Wow.
Over $100 million budget.
Wow. So these are AAA games, big blockbuster Hollywood movie budgets. In fact, I think bigger than some movie budgets. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. So before we dive into what the product is today, you have a very interesting background. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually grew up on a cattle farm.
Okay.
Out in essentially the middle of nowhere.
How big was this cattle farm?
About 1,000 acres.
Wow.
We're very, very hardcore farmers. So grew up on this cattle farm, and I always really was drawn to games. Mm-hmm. So sort of got my first Nintendo DS when I was 11, 12 years old.
Awesome. Love a DS.
Always, played the hell out of it. But I was always frustrated with the lack of games out there.
Yep.
Wasn't a lot of Wi-Fi on the farm, couldn't really just download games on demand. And parents were quite strict with, obviously, buying new games. So I got insanely frustrated. And when I was 14, I actually picked up Unity for the first time. And I taught myself to make games.
Cool.
And I always gravitated towards, trying to create these RPGs. I grew immensely frustrated when I just couldn't make it as a solo creator. I had all these ideas in my head, but I couldn't actually bring it into the world.
And so you were 14, you're downloading Unity, what were you using Unity on? Was it a big clunky desktop machine? Or
No, I had a clapped $300 secondhand laptop. Might have had about 8 gigs of RAM. So I really, really had to soldier on.
Okay, gotcha. So not quite as good as the MacBook Pro I'm recording.
Not quite.
Okay, cool. And so then tell us a little bit more. So you tried to make these games. What happened then? Did it work?
Tried to make these games, always maybe got about 3 weeks to a project, and I would just naturally find myself abandoning it.
Right.
So there was just so much to build, and I grew really, really frustrated.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is I was banging my head against the wall, trying to make these games for so long.
Yeah.
I eventually started to branch out and meet people in the game developer community, and eventually pivoted into being a freelance game designer and game developer.
Cool.
So I just got to the realization that these games that I really wanted to make definitely wasn't happening now.
Okay.
Maybe in 10 years.
Okay. And so then tell us then, like, what does it entail to be a freelance game consultant developer?
So I was writing game design documents primarily.
Yep.
So essentially before a studio goes to make a game, they will sit down, they'll write this 100-page document that outlines just about everything that happens in the game, like the assets that need to be made, the mechanic systems, like what all the characters are, what the dialogue system looks like.
Gotcha.
Just think of it as like the master plan for these games.
Right, gotcha.
Which is very, very important for, say, indie developers looking to obviously attract a game producer to publish their game.
Mm-hmm. How big could these documents get?
These documents can get to around like 100 pages.
Right. So the analogy would be, what's a good analogy for them? Like a script for a movie?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Script for a movie that involved all the set details and the entire cast.
Right.
The master document.
And any notable clients you had while you're sort of doing this consulting work? I mean, how old were you when you were doing this consulting work?
I think I was around like 15, 16.
Okay. So and so you got to work with these indie developers. Like, why did they pick you, or how did you win clients out of interest?
So what usually ended up happening? So there were mainly game developers that were working out of the Google Docs PDF sheet. They grew their team to around like 10 people, and they definitely lost direction of the game. So that is primarily like why they decided to, bring on board a game designer and help them out, keep the whole team aligned.
I see. So almost an external editor kind of thing to
Absolutely.
Push direction. Okay, cool. And during this period, did you work on a few games, or was this like one major client that you sort of supported?
I worked on a couple of games. Okay. So although I was writing the game design documents, I was also balancing systems and hopping in and doing a bit of coding as well.
Okay, great. So then you were doing coding, you were helping with the game design, and then tell us then, how did you kind of, come to start Tempest AI? What was that sort of period up to leading up to that?
Absolutely. So I graduated high school, ended up
good.
to university.
Okay.
When I was at university was...
Left the cattle farm, because you...
Yes, left the cattle farm, came to Sydney, and I actually ended up studying finance at Sydney Uni.
Oh, I did not know that.
So I was actually trying to break into the industry. So I was emailing like a bunch of different people, just trying to get my foot in the door somewhere.
Okay.
But couldn't end up doing that. So got to around, first year of university.
Yep.
Was like, have to get a bit serious, have to like go and study finance as one does. Always had like games in the back of my mind. I was still playing, but fell out of love with the actual creation aspect.
Right.
And then GPT-3 first was launched publicly as an API.
Yep.
And I remember playing around with it with a couple of friends in the dorm room.
Right.
And I suddenly realized I had all these old game projects.
Yeah.
So I actually ended up, revisiting a lot of these projects and experimenting with AI-powered NPCs and lots of fun stuff like that. And eventually got to the realization that, these LLMs are these like really, really amazing emerging tools, especially from a narrative perspective. And sort of just went from there. Started tinkering around, made a super simple Dungeon Master bot.
Okay.
Which was essentially a very, very, a very bad ChatGPT wrapper.
Yeah.
But it worked.
Okay.
And to me, it was, quite magical that I built this thing. Working.
You got the feeling of...
Got the feeling of what was possible.
I mean, this is GPT-3, right? So this is what, 2022?
21?
21? Yeah, 21, 22. Okay, so this is super early, right? Ahead of, obviously, GPT-4, which kind of became more mainstream. What else did you discover during the early years of GPT being released?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely got a grasp of, how LLMs really, really work. And also noticed a lot of problems and a lot of hurdles in order to actually implement these LLMs into games.
Yeah.
Because games are insanely complicated.
Yeah.
And these generative systems, they really run off context.
Yeah.
And defining context within games is really, really hard. So in order to actually build these generative systems in the game, whether that is a AI-powered NPC system. Designing these like context systems really hard. So that's often why we get these almost like novelty features for people who are playing around with generative AI. We don't have an actual implementation of NPCs that can move out of just talking and actually do stuff in these games.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then these limitations you were hitting upon, what then led you down the path of going, well, how did you want to solve that, I guess? Tell us about that sort of spark to then start Tempest.
Yeah. So with the whole context system, we were tossing up whether or not we started to attach some of these functionalities to an existing game engine. But we just kept running into these context issues. So it's really hard. So obviously with Tempest, we always envisioned it as being a sandbox system.
Yeah.
We didn't prescribe creators to create a very specific templated RPG system.
Yeah.
We want to let creators build absolutely anything.
Yeah.
And because of that, it was really hard to build that context system. And we had initially envisioned going into an existing game engine and building on top of that.
Yeah.
So that context issue was one of the main reasons we decided to build everything ourselves from the ground up.
Gotcha. Tell us about the launch story, right? Because I met you after the first launch, and maybe it might be good to people just give a bit of context around that. What was the first launch and how did that go?
Yeah, absolutely. So probably not the first launch. I think that was the second launch.
Sure.
Or it might have been the third.
Yeah, sure.
So we are always launching. So I've been working on Tempest for about a year and a half. Our first launch really was that really simple ChatGPT wrapper. That second launch, just before we met, was a more consolidated product. It was very much templated towards RPGs.
Okay.
And we actually launched, crazy story, I was in San Francisco last year and out of nowhere just gave a demo at an event.
Yep.
And the product hunt CEO was actually there.
Oh, cool. Nice.
He
Cool story.
saw the demo, thought it was super cool, and encouraged us.
This is last year, so 2024?
Yeah, 2024.
Yeah.
Saw the product, thought it was super cool, and encouraged us to launch within 3 hours.
Awesome. Fantastic. And did you launch?
We did.
Okay.
We did.
And how did the launch go on Product Hunt?
Yeah, it went amazing. Really sort of put us on the map and got a massive influx of traffic of people across the world. And it really was quite magical to see, people soldiering on with these really unpolished tools.
And so give us some numbers and what were they built, and some examples of what they created.
Yeah, so for that launch, we got over 2 days around 1,500 unique users, which was absolutely insane. Massive variety of games. So obviously on Product Hunt, we launched globally. So we had people from China, people from America, South America, absolutely worldwide. Sort of the genre of games that people were making were really quite broad.
Okay.
So we had people who were working on, say, Lord of the Rings clones. We had somebody who was, I can't say that. Had somebody who was building, Lord of the Rings clone, a lot of fantasy RPGs.
Yeah.
People are working on survival simulations, people diving into horror.
Yeah.
So
it wasn't one particular theme, it was a mixture of games.
Absolutely.
And so 1,500 users, how many games were created?
So over that period, we had over 120 games created.
Wow, that's wild. That's wild. I mean, I remember when we talked about this is one of the original reasons why we were super interested to invest. So you did that second, third launch, whatever iteration. What were the lessons from that out of interest? High level.
Yeah, high level, absolutely. One of the things we really learned is a game that is pure storytelling without any game mechanics tends to be quite boring.
Interesting.
So at that point, Tempest was very narrative heavy. So you could essentially create these choose your own adventures, but they lacked that deeper, obviously game level. There were no systems like inventory, any combat. It was essentially just a interactive storytelling experience.
Gotcha.
And what we really learned is that a lot of the users who were using this platform, they really wanted these mechanic features, But like those features themselves, they weren't out there at all. So either people had the vibe coding platforms where you could essentially talk with a GPT and it would spin you up a web app representing a game.
Yeah, and just a quick plug, if you don't know what vibe coding is, check out our last podcast where we talk about it.
Absolutely. And the other side were these like pure LLM based experiences.
Yeah.
However, the almost the platform that existed in the middle that allowed you to create these storytelling games with generative AI like at the heart, and also those platforms where you could actually code game logic and you could get a core game loop working. Nothing existed in the middle. There wasn't a platform that could do both.
I see. Right. So you either had stuff that was super simple, but then was boring to play but fun to create a demo, or you had stuff that was way too complicated and there was nothing necessarily in the middle. One of the things that have come up for me in questions when I talk about you is that I've seen a lot of new game development tools come out. Why did you make the effort or make the decision not to go after game developers like studios and tools for studios versus actually creating a tool for hobbyists? I call them hobbyists, but gamers to create games.
Absolutely. So like our thesis from day one is, the creators out there are, relatively unknown. A lot of the really, really creative ideas that people have, these people aren't working in the game industry. And we always wanted to create a platform where we just really democratize this whole game development process. So if you're essentially not in the industry, you're not working at an indie studio, it's really, really hard to bring your ideas to life.
Gotcha. So it was very much about enabling a new class of game creators.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's fast forward to today. Tell us, what can you do on the platform today, and is it accessible? Can people access it?
Yeah. So Tempest is accessible. We are live right now. So yeah, it's very good. Fifth launch. So with Tempest AI, a lot of people draw comparisons to a tool called Scratch.
Okay.
So it is completely no code. With Tempest, you create an entire game on a single canvas on the web. We support just about any single game mechanic that is turn-based. So with Tempest, you can essentially prompt for any mechanic you want, and we will automatically create that in the game and give you some visual scripting blocks so you can actually script out all that logic.
Gotcha.
And we also have a inbuilt AI system that uses almost custom code as context. So with this AI system, I can make an inventory system, this whole map system, and I can create agents on that creation dashboard that use those as context, so they continually update.
Gotcha.
Some of the cool things that our alpha users have made are these endlessly expanding maps. So they have a system where this AI essentially monitors how far the player has explored in the world, what locations they've gone to, and then based off that, actually creates new locations.
Cool.
Implements them in the game.
That's cool.
And it doesn't implement it in the game in terms of just asking an LLM to keep in its context window what locations the player could visit. But actually, creating those objects and putting it into
the game.
Yeah, the game.
Gotcha. So you've got what did you call it? Game canvas?
Game canvas.
Yeah, so you've got a game canvas, and on that you create the narrative, the levels and the characters, and then you essentially have your own sort of AI engine, to loosely put it, to help you with that. So tell us a little bit about how your AI engine works at a high level, just for those that are sort of interested in listening.
Yeah, so higher level. So Tempest is built on an architecture called Entity Component System. Not really important what exactly it does, but what it does is it keeps the code very, very modular. Gotcha. So it essentially allows an LLM to continually add stuff to this game without being required to go back and refactor all of this logic.
Right.
And what we're also doing is essentially within this code, maybe I coded a combat system. So I have a combat system and all the characters have a health, a max health attribute.
Gotcha.
So from all of this custom code, we essentially extrapolate context from that.
Okay.
By building up all these components, attaching them to game assets,
Yep.
and then letting the LLM essentially use that actual like code and the value of that component as context.
I see, gotcha.
Super high level, just what that means is I can have an inventory system. I attach it to a game asset,
Yeah.
and LLM has access to that custom system that I've made and can see what's in that actual inventory, and it continually updates.
I guess on the product, like what's been some of the cool things that have been created so far on the new one?
Right, definitely. There have been some like really, really creative game mechanics that people have been exploring. So, example is somebody worked on a game where one of the games that had the endlessly expanding map.
Yep.
It was also spinning out new enemies dynamically.
Yeah,
So essentially they made a game with this full RPG rule set.
Yep.
But all the content, the whole story was generated on the fly as we were actually playing.
Oh, very cool.
So that was like super, super cool. There's another cool game where you are essentially one human amongst 7 AI agents.
Okay.
And it is a game where you have to survive until the end. And
One human among 7 AI.
one human among 7 AI agents.
So it's like a spin on the survival games.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like,
And everyone's trying to guess who the human is, so you have to remain like undetected.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's fun.
So yeah, like obviously quite the variety of stuff people are creating on Tempest.
Awesome. And can people go to the website and play these games now?
Yes, they absolutely can.
Okay, great. We'll chuck a link and everyone can go play and let me know what you think. Let's switch gear then into the games landscape right now. So, you were here for GDC, which is the big game developer conference in San Francisco last week. What is the landscape like in games and AI right now?
Yeah, it is definitely the Wild West at the moment.
Okay.
So there are quite a few tools on the developer side that are aiming to obviously help speed up development within their studios.
And that's like selling to game studios,
selling
right?
to game studios. So a lot of people are working on obviously 3D generation, which again is like a massive aspect of game development and probably one of the most time consuming.
Yep.
As for people,
we've seen the demos of those rich 3D worlds which are endlessly being generated as you walk through them, which look really cool.
Absolutely. But yeah, just in general, a lot of people are working on tools to help the developers of these studios.
Yep.
But for actually implementing AI within the game, there have been like very, very few examples of that. So obviously we have InWorld who have the character engine. Quite a few studios are playing around with that, but we don't yet have any obviously live games who are actually using these generative features at the core.
So my thesis on this is that this is potentially like a new category of product. Like, how do you think about it? Do you think it's a new category? Do you think it's just a spin on something new, old? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I absolutely view it as almost a spin on the tabletop role-playing game genre.
Okay.
Which is obviously the precursor to modern-day RPGs.
Okay.
Tabletop role-playing games, just think Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
So obviously games like that, with that storytelling aspect, so those games would traditionally be played with a dungeon master, a real-life person who would sit down at a table with all the players and narrate the story and decide what happens.
Yep.
Obviously, those games without like AI were basically impossible to create. So we ended up with a distilled down RPG game genre. So with Tempest, I think we can begin to like revisit that like super old genre, and also essentially maybe create a new one.
And what do you think the new one might look like, or hope it will look like?
So a couple of people have coined the term generative role-playing games.
I like that. First time you've heard it here. Generative role-playing games.
Generative role-playing
GRPG.
games. And to me, these types of games...
I like that because you take the AI out of it, which has obviously got some negative connotations, which we'll talk about in a second. But
yeah, to me, like that genre very much is characterized by a few things. I think the number one thing is procedural generation.
Okay.
So
what does that mean?
Generative role-playing games that essentially generate themselves as people are playing.
Gotcha.
So with these games, they essentially have some base rules. They might outline like a base inventory system, like a base structure to this game. but all of the content is actually filled in as people are playing.
Gotcha. And so if you have a situation like that, like where does the game end? How do you kind of have that finish point, or do you not have that?
Well, with these games, you may never have a finishing point. It really is a blue ocean.
Oh. Is that satisfying to play though?
Definitely could be.
Okay.
Obviously, you know, a lot of live service games, they have the same basic core loop.
Yeah.
You know, people sink thousands and thousands of hours into it. So
Sure. I guess if you think about
more
World of Warcraft, right, is there an end? You know, you level up and you get to, you know, you keep playing. I mean, when I was younger, I spent many hours on WoW, which was too many hours spent. I'm guessing there's yet to be a hit JRPG.
Not yet. There have been a couple of viral instances.
Yeah, but I'm guessing there's yet to be like a big hit.
There's yet to be a big hit.
Until people make one on Tempest. Yeah, that's right. Tell us a little bit more about what's been like at GDC, the Games Developer Conference, and for those that don't know what that is, maybe give a quick intro on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So GDC is the biggest game developers conference in the world.
Yep.
So every year, around 30,000 indie developers, AAA studios, game investors, hobbyists all gather in a place for a week of conferences, networking.
And everything fun.
And everything fun.
Yeah. And what's it been like this year?
Yeah, GDC this year was absolutely manic.
Yeah.
We met like a ridiculous amount of people, and it's like super cool just to... Where was I? Like... It is super cool just to see the variety of people that are like end up coming to GDC and get a sneak preview as to what everyone is working on.
Yeah, what's coming around the corner.
Yeah.
What has been your biggest surprise?
Big surprise was definitely there is quite a bit of negative sentiment within the industry at the moment.
Yeah. And where do you think that stems from?
I think that primarily stems from obviously the creative aspects of game development. A lot of people do view AI as a threat, like in general. Yeah. Especially, you know, like artists and writers.
And that's primarily because they view it as taking their work and livelihood, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. At the end of the day, human creativity will always rise above all. Yeah. But LLMs, generative AI in general, are just really a tool to speed up everything. Yeah, I agree.
Well, you know, hopefully we'll see some good examples of people being able to create these wildly complex games that otherwise would need, 200, 300 staff, but instead can be one really talented creator or, a small group of them in your case. And so tell us then, with this negative sentiment, like what does that mean for the games industry right now?
Absolutely. So what it looks like right now is a lot of studios aren't experimenting as much as they probably could.
Okay. So they're holding back on AI experimentation.
Definitely holding back. Which is definitely evident a lot more in the more established studios. Yeah, a lot of indie developers are experimenting quite a bit, but there just hasn't been a lot of adoption.
So you've seen the cross-section of everything at GDC. What's been give us a couple of impressive examples you've seen of indie developers using AI or just interesting games.
Interesting games. A lot of in-worlds demos were super cool. Yep. See, they had a demo where essentially you had an AI partner, and it was like a puzzle game where you had to communicate with your, the AI NPC and get them to move around the map and help you.
Oh, cool! So having the AI character was built into the mechanic rather than an extra thing you add on. Yeah, cool.
Other examples. There was a really cool example of somebody who was making a card game, like a Balatro.
Yep.
It's like a relatively new card game where all of the cards were generated by LLMs on the fly. That was super cool.
Right. And what does a card look like then?
Yep. So it was almost like Magic the Gathering, where you had those cards with the characters that had all of their damage stats and special abilities. Yep. Essentially, they had built a game where essentially at the start you just prompt for your cards and it'll make them for you.
Cool. That's interesting. So it's a bit of a new game dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people are really exploring these generative game mechanics.
Yeah.
Which is super interesting.
Yeah, I guess we're still at early days. If you think about your standout meetings, is there anything you can share? Any standout meetings that have been interesting and why?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share a couple.
Okay.
So a lot of our time at GDC has been speaking with game developers and actually sitting down with them and obviously showing off Tempest and almost doing some co-building sessions.
Yeah. What has there been reaction when you show it off to them?
Reaction has been very, very good because Tempest right now is very much more of a tool rather than a complete solution for making end-to-end games. So at the end of the day, Tempest is a tool that lets people make games without having to write any code. But the tool itself is very, very deterministic. So we can actually sit down and plan out these games. We have a lot of control as to what the end product actually looks like. And that is something that appeals to game developers quite a bit.
What is your advice to future game developers who may be listening to this podcast? Who are building the age of AI today?
Absolutely. One bit of advice is really experiment as much as you can with that generative AI in games. I think a lot of people think that obviously the first really, really useful use case for generative AI in games is going to be NPCs. But all the game developers out there, I think I recommend that they get a little bit more creative than that.
Okay. You think that's table stakes?
I think it's, absolutely table stakes. And I think there is going to be a new genre emerge, but I'm also a new class of game mechanics that I think are, insanely personalized and, players are going to love. And it might not just be AI-powered NPCs.
What else could it be?
It could, obviously I'm going to go back to some of the examples that Tempest. It could be generative content. It could be a system where a DM essentially dynamically rebalances enemies based off the player's collected loot and whatnot.
I mean, I guess the analogy would be up until now, you can go into a game system and go medium, easy, medium, or hard, right? What you're saying now is be ultra personalized to you.
Ultra personalized, absolutely.
Yeah, which is really fascinating to think about, because if you think about any of the complicated games like Fallout, there's just so many areas that could be really personalized.
Absolutely.
Cool. A final question and final plug for us. How's it been having the Galileo San Francisco office work out?
The Galileo office is absolutely awesome.
Great.
Central location. It's super close to everything. People around here work super, super hard. So there are some very, very talented startup founders around here. And some people doing some really, really cool stuff. So absolutely love
It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. There's 80 YC startups in this building, so that's pretty fun. All right. Thanks very much, Jack. That's all we have time for today. I know you've got a super busy schedule today, so thanks for joining us for the pod, and looking forward to getting you on again in the future and seeing what people create on Tempest AI.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.